November Accounts Receivable Core Committee meeting. My name is Gerald Floyd. I'm the Statewide Accounts Receivable Management Coordinator here at the Department of Administrative Services. Just a couple of reminders. Please make sure that your computers are on mute unless you have a question during the meeting. Then feel free to pipe up and ask your question at the time or your comment. So thank you for that. We'll go ahead and get started on our agenda today. First off, swarm announcements. Wanted to share, I know that this won't necessarily apply to everyone, but wanted to make everyone aware that on October 10th, I had the privilege of participating on a panel to do training on vendor garnishment, otherwise known as vendor coordination. And that training was recorded, and there were some FAQs from that, and that is now available online. And let me switch my screen here. So this was a presentation in coordination with Liz Schultz from the SFMA group here at DAS, as well as Chantil from the Department of Revenue, kind of giving a overview of the entire vendor coordination process. That training is now on the SFMA training site down here under vendor garnishments. So you can take a look at that if it's something that you may be involved with accounts payable for your agency and you weren't able to attend. This is some good training for you on what happens when you go to make a payment and the vendor is deactivated in SFMA. So just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that training. And so wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. And I just realized that I do not have my web browser on the right monitor here. Sorry about that. So here is the SFMA supplemental training website. And I will put this in the minutes as well and go down to vendor garnishments. And here's the recording, the slides, and FAQs. So again, just wanted to share with everyone that that is a training that if you do accounts payable and you see that vendor is deactivated, this is a training on what that process would look like and how you should handle those situations. So definitely something that impacts Department of Revenue and the processes for how they garnish those vendor payments. Again, understand that not everybody in this group is involved on the payable side, but there is some crossover, so wanted to share this here as well. Any questions on that? All right.
Sorry, Gerald, this is Lisa at Aviation. Would this also apply for vendors that are in teams, ODOT teams?
It does, although the mechanics of what you would see in teams will obviously be different than what you would see in this particular training that provides the examples within SFMA. The process of how you notify DOR and how they issue the garnishment is the same, but the mechanics of the team's screens and so forth are not part of this training.
Okay, very good.
Thank you. The overall workflow is the same, but there are some obviously some system differences there. Yeah, Heidi.
So, out of curiosity, say, for example, John Smith had an overpayment with us. They paid it, but they overpaid it. So if we need to do a revenue refund, is that garnishable? Would that go through that same process, or would it go straight back to the vendor?
So my question there back to you would be, it probably depends on what system it comes out of. I know that there are some of those systems that were identified as not doing the matching process because they were, a benefits program. And so if you're making the refund through the benefits program, I don't, the expectation is to not have to create a new process. But if you are doing the overpayment refund through SFMA, and they are a vendor in SFMA, and or a match has occurred and deactivated that vendor, then you would follow that process because it's no longer a benefit payment that you are refunding or paying. So it's now becomes a garnishable payment amount.
Thank you.
But if you're doing the refund through your subsidiary system, it's likely not going to come up as a match process because you're importing, in summary, if you will, into SFMA, not making the payment directly in SFMA.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay. I wanted to take a few minutes and share with this group now that the LFO and fiscal year 24 reporting season is concluded. Wanted to kind of share with you some highlights of that. And this is basically just a high-level overview. We are currently in the drafting stages of the accounts receivable management report, as well as the legislative report on debts that were written off, abated, and canceled. So this is kind of from some of the analysis done for those reports. Wanted to give you a high-level summary of what you will see in those reports when they are published. First of all, in the ARPM, when we compare fiscal year 24 to 23, the total accounts receivable collections increased about 2.7 billion. A large change of that came from, were identified as being from PERS and ODOT due to programs that were not previously reported. So not necessarily, a change in what they actually did, but more the data and being more accurate with the submission in the ARPMs there. The L&D collections went up about $52 million, and most of that came from Department of Revenue due to increased garnishment activity and refund offsets from the kicker. Total outstanding accounts
Are there
receivable.
some slides we should be seeing, because we're only seeing the agenda?
Let me move this screen over here. There we go. These are just more notes than anything, not necessarily slides, but just kind of some notes. Total outstanding receivables went up about 500 million. No specifics on that, just overall activity going up in regards to ARPM totals. So no concerns on our part there. The over 90 days past due as a percentage did go down slightly, so that's moving in the right direction. Would obviously, love to see that go down even more, but I think, this is probably, I guess you could call it almost a plateau of what we would expect based on, what is included in the LFO reporting. And, there are a certain number of accounts that not every agency can control the accounts that go more than 90 days past due. So we certainly recognize that. down. So more information from the ARPM summary. The percentage of accounts that were paid in full within 60 days is pretty static for the last few years. Has been in that 72% range. And then the average accounts assigned within 90 days did go up a little bit. So, some of this is, will fluctuate depending on the volume of assignments that occur. But obviously, the statute has a timeline for doing that. However, within the ARPM, for example, if an account is on a payment plan and then they stop making the payments, you may have a report of an account that's assigned, say, at 6 months. It doesn't mean that you were not assigning within the statutory timeline, but those first 3 months or 4 months perhaps were the initial payment plan before they stopped making their payments, and then the assignment occurred. So we recognize that it's not going to be 100% for all agencies, even if they are 100% in compliance with the statute. So it's just how the evaluation of the data occurs. And then finally, from the ARPMs, write-offs as a percentage of available accounts receivable remains static at 0.3%. And here is some comparisons looking at executive branch data from the LFO reporting. One of the things that we do in the management report is we provide a summary of the information by branch, but due to the executive branch being subject to the OAM policies, we do a deeper dive into the executive branch changes. And so here you can see overall additions went up, collections went up, write-offs went up, the adjustments as a negative value went up. It looks a little funny because it's a negative value, but there were more negative adjustments in 24 versus 23. And however, reversals decreased by about $10 million. And overall, the ending balance from the LFO for executive branch went up about $340 million. Subsequent to that, accounts that are assigned to either Department of Revenue or a private collection firm. We had additions go up and collections, as well as accounts returned to the originating agency. And the overall DOR OAA ending balance decreased slightly, while the PCF activity had about $100 million more in additions to the PCF, and roughly that same $100 million for their ending balance. A large portion of that is basically most of those accounts are from Department of Revenue on the tax side. And this is not including the accounts that DOR OAA has forwarded to a PCF, just what DOR as the agency has reported to LFO. And that increase in additions, part of that was identified from FY23. There was some programming, accounts that should have been assigned, but the programming wasn't picking them up to do the assignments. That was fixed in 24. So you have a general overall increase in volume at DOR, plus those accounts that would have otherwise previously been assigned. That's kind of accounting for that large change in the additions for the PCF activity. And then accounts that are exempt from assignment, we break it down into those that are administratively exempt, which is the items that are in the OAM that are in addition to what is listed in ORS 293, which is the statutory exemptions. And so just for a breakdown, overall administrative exemptions went up a little over 100 million, while the statutory exemptions increased by about 45. And the exemptions as a percentage of the overall L&D ending balance decreased slightly, but it has been in that 50% range for a few years now. So no big changes, from that regard. And so overall, things were kind of as we expected, and the data, I think, is getting a little bit better. We always do find a few cases where, certain program areas were not included in prior years. Like on the ARPM side, we're seeing that continue to evolve for agencies as we go on. So one last thing here, we have a breakdown that we put into the management report that breaks down as far as those overall exemption entries, which ones are the most used. And in this case, the DAS approved exemptions, spousal child support, payment on multiple accounts, and hospitalized debtor are the four categories that had the most exemptions reported for FY24. So with that, any questions? Okay, let me move this. Actually, let me go down here just a little bit. So just kind of some other notes. Reminders that when you are establishing collection targets in your ARPM, if you go to the next quarter and enter your projected new AR established, again, putting it on your crystal ball and kind of guessing what's going to happen either based on historical activity or things that you might anticipate occurring in that next quarter. If you go in and put that in for the next quarter as a projected value and then come back to your collections tab, when you enter the next quarter percentage target, it will then calculate that into a value for the next quarter. And you can kind of adjust that. We've talked about this in prior meetings, but just a reminder here, you can play with those percentages until the value that shows up for the next quarter is close to what you reasonably anticipate your total collections and or your L&D collections to be in that next quarter, as a way of kind of double checking what will that percentage translate to if that assumption for new AR takes place in that next quarter. So again, just kind of a way that you can kind of double check some things and see what that will do. Sometimes when you see a big variance between your actual and the calculated target, your actual collections, that is, this is a way that you can kind of verify some of those assumptions before you submit your report for that next quarter percentage. Next, wanted to remind everyone, as a reasonableness check, one of the things that I will do when an ARPM report is submitted is I will calculate what the current quarter ending balance would be, which is using a formula: beginning balance plus the new AR less the collections is a calculated value, and I compare that with what the reported ending balance is for the quarter, just to see how close that is. We recognize that there are entries that affect the ending balance that are not part of the ARPM. And so we don't expect that value to be exact, But again, it's a reasonableness check to say how close is this? Is there some other thing in here that we either, is not being picked up correctly, or are those other entries such as an adjustment, a write-off, an abated account, etc., were they sort of the anomaly that has significantly changed that ending balance? I just want to verify that. This is a way that you can do the same calculation and say, okay, that calculated value versus what I'm reporting is different because, and then put that because in your agency comment field in the ARPM. That helps me to understand why there was a significant variance between the calculated value and the reported value. Next, on days to assign for the ARPM, remember that you only report, now this is an annual measure, you only report an account in this tab if it was actually assigned during the fiscal year that's being reported. If you have 10 accounts at Department of Revenue, and they were assigned over the past 5 years, don't make that row 10 be equal to the count of 10 that's currently at DOR. It's not what is at DOR, but rather what was assigned during the fiscal year. And the calculation should be based on the MCAT eligibility date in the OAM, which is either the latter of the date that became both liquidated delinquent or the date that an exemption expires. So if you have not assigned an account because it is currently under litigation, for example, and you report that to LFO as an exemption because of that, you would not begin, and then later that litigation becomes final, so it's no longer under litigation. Now that exemption expires, and now it starts that clock for the 90 days to assign it to DOR. You would report the days to assign as from when the exemption expired until the date that you actually sent it to DOR, not when the account originally became liquidated and delinquent and spent 2 years in litigation. You don't report it as over 1 year. It's from when the litigation ended and the exemption expired. So just want to make sure that we clarify that so that there's some consistency there. The only reason that you should have an account, I won't say only, the primary reason you would have an account that is assigned after 90 days, assuming that you're following the provisions of ORS 293, is an account that's on a payment plan, because that is a liquidated and delinquent account. So, and there's no exemption. So you start the MCAT eligibility date from when it became liquidated and delinquent, but ORS 293 doesn't require the assignment unless there are 90 days with no payment. So again, if 4 months go by and they're making their payments and they suddenly stop, then you assign it to DOR. That would be a reason why you would have an account, say at 6 months, even though you assigned it within the 90 days since the last payment. So just want to make sure that everyone's being consistent with that. So just a reminder. And then on the write-offs tab for the ARPM, only include the accounts that are truly based on a write-off for uncollectability according to OAM 355010, and that it is still a legally valid debt to collect. If it's an adjustment, an abated account, some other cancellation of some kind, it would not be included in the ARPM as a write-off. I understand that the entries in SFMA may be very similar, but this is truly only for accounts that are written off due to uncollectability as defined in the OAM. So those are just kind of some notes that I had after going through the reporting process, and wanted to kind of share those while it was still somewhat fresh in both my mind as well as those of you that did the reporting. So any questions on any of the data, the reminders, any of that information?
Yeah, I have a question
Okay,
about the
go
dates
ahead.
to assign, about the dates to assignment. So let's say something's about time to send to collections, and then a person makes like a partial payment. They're not on a payment plan. We receive a partial payment before it actually got sent to collections. Does that MCAT start over at that point, or do they have to have a payment plan for it to start?
That's a good example. You could have somebody that just kind of randomly makes payments. Again, the ORS 293 says that you have to send it to DOR when there has been no payments for more than 90 days. So you're kind of tracking it. It's say 45 days and you suddenly get a partial payment, but it wasn't due to a agreed upon payment plan.
Right.
So for purposes of the MCAT eligibility date does not start over, but that's another example of a situation where you may actually do the assignment after 90 days from when it became liquidated and delinquent, but you're within the statutory provisions because the clock started over at 45 days when you got that partial payment.
Okay, so if you got the partial payment, you wouldn't have to turn it, you wouldn't have to sign it, you wouldn't have to sign it for another 90 days.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, we'll move on in our agenda. Next topic, DOR assignment format discussion. I was contacted by DOR to kind of bring this up as a way to encourage agencies to use the XML format for assignment. They currently have multiple ways that you can assign accounts to them. The XML is the one that provides kind of the most consistent, I'll call it, in terms of the way that the file has to be constructed as far as fields that need to be completed, such as the FEIN number. And using the XML reduces the amount of suspense work that DOR has to do because they need to go and kind of fill in the blanks with other formats that don't have all of those same field requirements. So it can take longer for the account to actually get into their system, for them to send the demand notice, and then to begin the life cycle of collecting. It's just kind of the most secure, most accurate, if you will, in terms of those formats. Did want to share that if you go to the Swarm website here and click on the AR resources under the quick links, and then you'll notice the quick link for Department of Revenue other agency accounts. There we go. And when you get to that site, as you scroll down here, there's some links for an XML data transfer guide, and that is let's see here. Yeah, my screen's, let's try this. There we go. So this is the data transfer guide. It kind of walks you through how the files are submitted, the XML files that are defined by schema, kind of goes through and tells you what those different field elements are. There's headers, number of records. It's basically a way for them to see there should have been, for example, 20 records. Are there actually 20 records in the file? So it's, from a systems perspective, allows for some of that data validation to occur. So this gives you information about the fields and the formats. If you are unsure about how, to create the XML formats, or you need any other assistance, my recommendation is to reach out to this oaa.technicalhelp@dor.oregon.gov email, and they probably have folks that are much more technically inclined than I am as to be able to answer your questions about the actual creation of the XML format. But here are some links to give you some information if you're not currently using the XML. Basically, this is a format that we should be moving towards because it is a better, more accurate format for them to receive that information in. So, again, I'm not a technical wizard on XML formatting, but does anybody have any questions about, assigning accounts to be an XML format? I would say at some point, I would anticipate they will migrate away from other formats, paper, Excel files, etc., and you would either enter directly into Revenue Online or use the XML format at some point in the future. I know they've tried to be as flexible as possible, but at some point they will likely need to, start narrowing the scope of formats that they receive files in. There is no timeline for that. There's no, official decision made. This is just my hunch that at some point this will need to be a more of a directive, whereas today it is encouraging you to begin to look at using that file format if you're not already doing so. Any questions? Hearing none. Okay. Any topics for roundtable? Oh, sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking over this data transfer sheet, and I guess I just want a confirmation. We submit everything directly online into the revenue website individually because we don't have very many. So that is acceptable. Is that correct? To continue doing that? Okay, that's what I needed to know. Thank you.
Yeah, the XML is for those that would have 10, 20 plus assignments at any one time, and you're kind of downloading that information out of some other system, that type of thing, to create the XML format and upload them en masse. Individual entry is always still acceptable because it won't accept it without all the proper fields entered in that Revenue Online format. Any other questions, topics for roundtable? Okay. Seeing none, our next meeting will be on January 21st, 2025. I have to get used to saying that now. So thank you all for joining today. I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season and Happy New Year. And we will see you all in January. And we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerald.
Thank you.